Whoa. It's time to buckle that theological safety belt, friends.
We don't want any accidents.
No accidents here at Homebrewed Christianity, because today on the podcast, we're going international. We have a very special conversation about embodiment, the gaze, incarnation, and you're gonna get to hear. You're not gonna just hear someone that's like brilliant, but you know there are people that are connoisseurs of theology and accents. And Ola's going to bring the heat today.
Ola Sigurdson.
Yeah.
Heavenly Bodies, Incarnation, the Gaze, and Embodiment in Christian Theology.
This book is freaking awesome. So let's just, like, as we're jumping in this podcast, no, like, if you're one of those people that listen to Homebrew Christianity that are intro haters, just skip to the intro right now. Skip the intro, because this is straight up nerd gold. If you've never read Ola before, you're welcome. In advance, I'm telling you. It's awesome. He engages like the Christian tradition conversation around incarnation, contemporary philosophy, ontology, and politics of the body. It gives creative readings and intersectional engagements of all sorts of different disciplines and ideas and such. It's creative, it's inspiring, it's thought-provoking, it's challenging. And if you are a theology nerd, you're going to get the book before the end of the conversation. You're going to like pause it and be like, well, I guess I got to go ahead and order this. I hope I have Amazon Prime. Because it's that good. I'm just saying.
It's excellent.
And I really do hope you like it, because, well, I had 3 pages of topics we were going to talk about, and I only got through the first. So just out of sheer selfishness, I think you should tweet about this episode and be like, hashtag Ola rules. I mean, I don't know if he uses Twitter, but I'll tell him about it. So yeah. So before we jump into this episode and get super nerdy, I just want to tell you that if you're near Minnesota, then in September 21st through the 23rd, you should join me at the Renew Conference. Rachel Held Evans is going to be there, and we're going to be having a live podcast in the middle of this conference where me and the one and only Greg Boyd are going to have some fun. Apparently, Rachel Held Evans is going to be judging who's going to win.
Ooh.
Our theological battle, process versus open theism. Now, I've not had it confirmed that part of the rules of this is that Greg and I consume the same amount of alcohol at the same pace. I think he thinks I should be full of the Holy Spirit, and I think I should taste IPAs. I don't know how this is going to work, but I do want you all, for those that still pray.
I think the key is to get Rachel also involved in that.
No,
might help the judging.
I want her to have a clear and sober assessment of the sheer preferential option for the metaphysical brilliance that is those inspired by Alfred North Whitehead. Anyway, there are other things that are going to happen there.
Didn't Greg do his dissertation on Hartshorn?
He did. He mentions it in the episode, and he's like, there are 5 things that Hartshorn thought, and 3 of them are good. The other 2 I don't like, because I like the Bible. And I'm like, I like the Bible, but the other 2 are still cool. And then there's going to be another hour and a half of the podcast after we say that. Also, we're launching something completely new and exciting. That in secret. If you're not on the email list, you should get on it. Go to homebrewchristianity.com, join the email list, because there are 36,000 people that are on it. You don't want to be left out. And then you'll find out. Don't be left behind. You know,
rumor has it that if you're on the email list, when the rapture comes, you're all good.
Yeah. I have a 100% confidence that should the rapture occur during your lifetime, if you are on the Homebrew Christianity email list, you will not be left behind.
You're good.
Like, I don't know if you've ever heard DC Talk sing the Larry Norman song Left Behind.
I have not.
A man and wife asleep in bed. She hears a noise and turns her head. He's gone. I wish he'd subscribe to Homebrew Christianity email list.
Oh, yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Now that you sing it.
Yeah, I know. Larry knew what's up. You know, the day after Alicia and I got engaged in college, we were 20. No, we were 19 when we got engaged. You know what we did the next day?
Go to a concert.
We drove to Florence, South Carolina to see Larry Norman in concert. And he's my favorite premillennial dispensationalist. And because we just got engaged and I'd seen him 13 other times, like every time he was on the East Coast until he died, my grandmother talked him into letting me sing with him.
What?
And I sang The Rock That Doesn't Roll.
Nice.
Yeah, with him.
Too bad.
You know how many people listening to this know what that means? Very few.
4.
No, I know Tom Ward does, though. There's also a guy that listens that wrote his dissertation on the Jesus people, like the hippie Christians.
Oh, really?
Music.
Oh, nice.
And he didn't like the theology of it at all. He thinks it's really weird. It was just like his academic topic as a European.
Oh, interesting.
And then I made some comment about Larry Norman at some point. And he's like, I've studied Larry, blah, 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 blah. I was like, I love Larry Norman. Now, half his songs I find problematic, but the other half, he's like an evangelical who's hardcore social justice warrior. And he's like, oh, no, I just studied him. I was like, never mind. I don't want you to.
But the key is to be on the email list.
Yeah.
So
Obviously.
that you can get all the information for this.
If you want to
awesome
be
thing.
rapture ready or just zesty ready.
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah. Also, you should tell everyone that you know that's a member of Homebrew Christianity. Thank you, because we have a few new members. They went to homebrewedcommunity.com. They joined. They're a part of supporting making the podcast possible. Part of the all the interaction and stuff online, getting special content and access to things, but they also represent less than 1% of the people that listen. So if you're part of the elect, then thank you. And if you're not, you should tell them thank you or become a member. But really, what I wanted people to know before we talk about incarnation and embodiment and the gaze, Nathan, is I wanted them to know about the theatrical gaze.
The theatrical gaze?
Yeah. Cinematic gaze, you could say.
Yes.
If someone was to go to theroadtoedmond.com to get their gaze on.
That's, I mean, that's one way of putting it, for sure. They would find that we are actually going to be in a movie that we'll probably be filming it actually while you're listening to this. Between Beer Camp in Denver and Oklahoma City, we'll be filming a movie called The Road to Edmond. You should go to theroadtoedmond.com and subscribe to the YouTube channel. That way you can watch the behind the scenes making of video blogs that we'll be doing the whole time, and you'll get to see awesome things like Trip riding a horse or trying to ride a horse. But they'll also see, let's see, what's something else in the movie we could mention that gives nothing away about the movie if we mention it. There will also be a van.
That's true. My character has a uniform.
Your character does have a uniform.
But not as cool as the uniform of the person who is a technician.
Yes, a technician. That's true.
And honestly, here's the thing. You know how sometimes you talk with your friends and there's a crazy idea and you talk it out and you're like, that's
good. We should do that. That's great. Yeah.
Well, then sometimes your friend emails you back and it's like, hey, dude, I got someone to write a check to make that movie. Are you serious? No, I'm pretty sure. I'm going to FaceTime you tomorrow. Just say funny stuff. All right. And I did.
And now it's a thing.
And now we're making a movie. Now, you know, my theory is it's either going to be amazing or an amazing story. You know what I mean?
One or the other.
But if you are a Homebrewed Christianity listener, you are going to get the full experience. Like, if we get done with it and I want no one to ever see it,
you will know.
You'll still get to see it.
Reason enough to become a member.
Yeah.
Right there.
Like, I'm just like, and the first screening of it, before it's even fully done, we're going to do at a secret time on the East Coast during some set event. And you should be there. It might be the only time I'm excited about it being shown in public.
It might be the only time it's shown in public. Who knows?
I'm optimistic it's not that bad. Like, the scene where I give a passionate monologue and tear up, I've practiced, and I think I'm pretty convinced. I can shed a tear. What I try to do is cultivate all the feelings I've had the last few years as a Laker fan and put it into my face. But try to imagine the Lakers' crappy seasons as my child and the disappointment I must have. And then I just tear up. You know, it's just so sad. But you know what's not sad? Getting to talk to Ola.
Nice transition.
Oh, that was professional. I mean, 1,001 episodes, and the junk is hot.
Coming in hot.
Mm-hmm. All right. So prepare yourself, because this is time. This is the time. This is the time for your audiological engagement with the Incarnation in ways you did not anticipate until you heard this, unless you've already read the book. In that case, you already know what's about to happen. But if you haven't, get ready. Get ready. And here's the thing. We don't know whether or not Nathaniel is going to appreciate Ola's answer to the question he really wanted me to ask him. You'll have to find out later.
Yeah.
Because Nathan is not as nice as me.
This is true.
It is true. He's just like, that was a nice trip. I don't really like that. That's what he'll say, and I'll just go along with the person and really enjoy and be like interactive, like I'm there with you. That's good. Nathan's like, meh.
That's it, right there.
So if you hear that noise,
nailed it
during the podcast, it's just like an overdub, a pause. Meh. That's Nathan. It's not me. That's not me. All right, here we go. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today we are talking to Ola Sigurdson. I am attempting to pronounce a very cool sounding name. But thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about your book, Heavenly Bodies, Incarnation, the Gaze, and Embodiment in Christian Theology.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I've been looking forward to this since I got your book, and that magical moment when you finally defend your dissertation and you read what you want. Your book was sitting there, if not just because the cover's really cool. But I do think that a lot of the conversations you pick up in the book are ones that people are having, and they haven't been put together in such a strong, constructive argument. So maybe we could begin by you sharing a little bit about yourself and your own background. Like, how did you end up becoming a Christian theologian and interested in the questions around embodiment and incarnation?
Oh, wow. Well, this is actually a long story, but to make it somewhat shorter, when I was studying, I studied philosophy and literature at the university, actually here in Gothenburg. I thought before I become whatever I was going to work with, I need to do some theology, because I was reading theology books in the evenings, and I was curious to deal with it further. So I went through an education at a theological seminar in Örebro, and then I did a dissertation at the University of Lund, also here in Sweden. And I completed my dissertation in 1996, and which was on the Swedish reception of the Swiss theologian Karl Barth's theology. But sometime around that time, I had I still have a friend who for some odd reason leaned into my ear and said, "Write a book on the body." He just said it, write a book on the body. And I thought about that, and I thought that would be kind of a good theme to write something about, because often the body is positioned as something that Christianity is negative towards. And so it would be an interesting topic. And then for various reasons, I got a 4-year postdoc position, allowing me to do whatever I wanted for 4 years. And I thought, okay, let's write a book on the body. So this is what I did between 2000 and say 2005. And the book, which you have now in English, was originally published in Swedish in 2006. And at that time, I had gotten my position as a senior lecturer in theology at the University of Gothenburg, and where I'm now a professor of systematic theology. And so the book was published in 2006, and well, in 2016, it was also published in English, which took some years because it's quite a substantial book. There are lots of pages. So the translator, Carl Olsen, did a wonderful job, and he was. I mean, it's a test of patience, of endurance, to actually having to translate such a long book, I think.
Mm-hmm. So when you have a book like this that you put 4 years into, and then it gets translated and gets a new audience, what when you're going back through the proofs and seeing the translation and things, like what were the big ideas when rereading it? You said, "Oh yeah, I'm proud of that one. Yeah, that's good."
Well, when I read it in translation, it was a more matter of of actually translating the words and the sentences and the chapters. So I didn't think that much about it, but I was actually surprised that early in my career ventured in writing a book on such a vast topic. As you mentioned in passing, it contains a lot of conversations with history, with biblical stuff, and with contemporary French theoreticians and so on. And so there's a lot of things going on in the book, and it's got 3 sections, and not only on embodiment, but also on the gaze and also on incarnation. And I think my impression was that, did I really dare writing such a huge book? And obviously I did. So I still think it stands, actually. Although I would have, had I rewritten it, I probably wouldn't have written it in the same way, and it would probably be much longer then also.
So when you began the research on it over those 4 years, like, what was the way you phrased the question or set up the concept behind the book that allowed you to hook together your working through the notion of the incarnation and the gaze and embodiment?
Well, I started out very simply with quoting Nietzsche, who suggests that Christianity has a contempt for everything material, including the body. And I thought, how could that be, given that Christianity is the religion of the Incarnation, that God became flesh in Christ? If Nietzsche was right, and I think he's both right and not right, but if he was completely right, that would have been a bit surprising, wouldn't it? Given the emphasis on embodiment in the Incarnation and the doctrine of Incarnation, it evolved during a couple of 100 or more years in the beginning of Christianity. So there was some intense work going on incarnation and on the body then. So how come it would have, if it had lost touch with those quite central roots, how would that be? And then I also thought maybe we understood the incarnation wrong in just thinking of it as a proposition. What would it mean to understand the incarnation more from experiential perspective? Phenomenology, the philosophical tradition of phenomenology, especially a French phenomenologist, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, plays a big role in the book, and he has a philosophy of embodiment. So I tried, and this philosophy of embodiment tries to work out what it means to experience yourself as an embodied agent. And so those were sort of the starting points in Nietzsche's question and Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, and to study the Christian tradition from there.
So, when you pick up the conversation of the Incarnation and make this turn towards phenomenological conversation partners and wanting to, kind of give an account of the Incarnation that isn't, at least shaped in dominating ways by a kind of how you get the two substances in the same place and this type of thing. How did you understand the early church's theological conversations that led to the doctrine of the Incarnation, kind of read back through the phenomenological categories?
Well, for one thing, I think that what they were after wasn't theoretical statements. It's theoretical too, but it's got an existential point. And that's the reason that they're using theoretical concepts. So all these talk about substances and natures and so on has to do with something that is experiential and existential. It's not about some kind of theoretical question that you need to solve like a puzzle. And secondly, I also wanted to show that this is actually a development. There's no doctrine in any static sense and that is primary for understanding what Christianity is about. The doctrines are pointers, they are tools, they are helpful, hopefully, in what it means to orient yourself with the help of the biblical tradition, but it's not the doctrines aren't the point. The point is something else, and so I try to sort of de-theorize those doctrines and not understanding them as propositions that wanted to map out what it means to understand God, but what they're trying to do is in an experiential and practical pointing to a mystery.
Mm-hmm. So you do this. You reframe the doctrine of the Incarnation, and one of the passages that stuck out to me that I think kind of sets up where you go is you said that speaking theologically, the Incarnation is thus not something that is finished with Jesus, but we must instead, in accordance with these arguments, imagine that it extends to and includes people's reception of Jesus. Can you kind of unpack the way in which a doctrine that a lot of Christians, will hear as a statement about a finished reality that happened, is really a conversation or a practice or an engagement for Christians that continues to extend over time?
I think it can be done in many different ways. Just let me begin by an example. I'm currently working on a book on humor, subjectivity, and transcendence. It's about, and I think that the doctrine of incarnation actually changed the perception of style in late antiquity, because obviously, if the divine is incarnated into such a lowly thing as a human life in Christ, that means something for how we orient ourselves, even aesthetically. So what the gospel says are, expect the transcendent in something very humble. And so I think this is a way that this is just an example, but it's one example of how the incarnation extends towards other areas of life and has been doing so since the original event, so to speak. But also in a more profound sense, I think we need to understand the incarnation also socially. So it's Jesus is not just an atomistic individual, but Jesus, as all human beings, are a relational being. So what he was also an effect of those he had relations to, and so they were also in some sense a part of the Incarnation. So in a way, I think the Incarnation continues into what we call the church. I don't mean a particular church, not a particular denomination, but the reception of Christ in ordinary life, which so trying to live a Christ-like life, whatever that means, is a way of continuing the Incarnation. Actually, quite literally, I think. So the Incarnation shouldn't be divorced from the church, even though there is a distinction between Christ and the church, of course.
Mm-hmm. So when you begin the kind of second part of the book, you say that you're wanting to see how the God relationship of the human being is given shape through the concept of the gaze. Now, for people that haven't hung out with French phenomenologists recently and know what the gaze is and what could be going on there, how would you introduce that concept so that they get the larger constructive proposal you make as you work through?
Right. I think every gaze, every look establishes a relation. But there are different relations you can establish by looking onto things. You can look onto something with desire, and you can look upon something with awe or with contempt, and so on. And all these express some kind of relationality. And what I wanted to do with this chapter was many things, but I wanted to take one of the senses. One of the five senses, and try to see how I could understand it in an incarnational way, and still try to explain this relationality. And obviously, I'm a member of the Church of Sweden, which is a Lutheran church, and if you learn something when you're a Lutheran, that is that faith comes from listening. Mm-hmm. And for different historical reasons, listening was the primary sense for Luther. And I wanted to show, not to diminish listening, but I wanted to show that looking is not necessarily, as it is sometimes conceived, a way to dominate other people. Just because I look onto something doesn't mean I want to own it, which has sometimes been said in the Protestant tradition, but I don't think that is true. And I want to establish a look which is generous and not possessive. So it's a way of establishing how the senses relate to your Umwelt. And I guess if in a much longer book there would be also chapters on hearing and touching and smelling and tasting. Some of them might be more trickier to write than others, but I think it could be done.
Well, in the chapter "The Eyes of Jesus," you look at the concept of like vision in different ways, his teaching, what happens in the way he looks at others, how others look at him, how God looks at him. And can you give an example or two of the way in which this avenue of inquiry brought you back to the Gospels to see, collect, hook together insights that aren't the normal text you go to when thinking about the Incarnation?
Oh, well, it's a sort of a function of that. I wanted to suggest that there is actually something about looking in the New Testament, and not only about hearing. Because if you don't, as a Lutheran, as I am, your default setting is that, well, the Gospels are probably says a lot about listening, but not that much about looking. So what I did was just basically to read it all through and make notes of every possible connection to some kind of looking or the eyes and so on. And I wanted to show that what I'm saying about relationality in looking as well as embodiment actually has a biblical base. So it's not just, an interpretation you can do when you have read French phenomenology, but it's actually also in the texts. So I'm trying in some sense to be a biblical theologian, although my theology goes further than perhaps the biblical witnesses do.
So if you were going to be picking one of the gospel texts to preach on, and they say, look, Ola, we want you to preach on the Incarnation, and you don't have to stick with the liturgical text. What gospel text are you going to pick?
Oh, that's I wish I had that question before. I don't know. I think it's. I would like to preach about the text that. Let me just look it up so I don't misquote it. I don't find it at the moment. I want to use one of the texts which speaks about desire and how to look about something with desire, and try to show that desire is not in gospel only something bad, but there's a desire for the kingdom of God, which means that it's not the eyes are not only about desiring, which in the sense of possessing something, but also desiring in the sense of longing. I'm sorry, I can't find the text at the moment.
Well, I could. There's a number of them that all pop there. The whole notion of seek first the kingdom of God is one. You find a treasure in a field and you desire it, so you go. You go get it. In the book, in the section, the eyes of faith. I think that there's the normal setting for the notion of faith in a kind of post-Enlightenment world is that the notion of faith is really believing all the things you can't see. It's post-rational and this type of thing. And you use Levinas and a number of people there to kind of point out that there is more to existence than just appearance, and that collapsing of everything is problematic. And you describe this you describe the erotic nature of the gaze and this kind of a depth dimension to, or kind of acknowledging the subjectivity of the other and this type of thing. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of contrast what you're wanting to describe, how you describe faith with some of the more shallow, simple, very flattened accounts that dominate talk among religious people?
Well, I try when I speak of faith here. It's usually a certain mode of life, a Christian mode of life. So I'm using faith in the sense of Christian faith, which is both a practice and cognitively so. So I don't speak about faith in contrast to reason. Right. For instance, and I think I try to keep actually to a very traditional, in the theological sense, traditional concept of faith, where faith means trust and belief in, and not on so to speak on bad grounds. It's not bad faith, but faith in trust. And what I try to show through Levinas and all the others is that kind of that everybody needs faith and everybody has faith, not necessarily a Christian faith, but there is some sort of genuine trust into reality, that it's really there and that we can somehow trust it. And that kind of faith could be minimal for persons for various reasons. But there's to be able to live, I think we all need faith. Not necessarily so in a religious sense, but it could be religious, could be Christian, but faith is not something that's gone away in the sort of post-Enlightenment society. It's just that we have a very shallow idea of what faith is, and so I think the concept of faith needs to be reclaimed and to be understood more broadly. I've dealt with the concept in perhaps a little more detail. I did some work on the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who is talking a lot about faith and belief, and he, as a psychoanalyst, also believes that faith is necessary to every people. And so his translation of faith would almost be engagement. So everybody who is living an engaged life needs faith in that sense. And so the question of reason is of course terribly important, but it's not a matter of a contrast to faith, but reason and non-reason comes in at a later stage, so to speak.
Well, one of the things that you describe in the book is the way that Jesus' own person, his deeds and stuff, have the character of epiphany, and that they reveal the presence of God to the human senses. So faith isn't like a direct line to God or something, but it's connected to this intuitive, being seized encounter with the divine reality that is connected to your own human embodiment, your own sensing and engaging the world, but it's not fully determined by it. Can you kind of unpack that, the way in which the notion of the incarnation is connected to this embodied notion of faith?
Okay. One of the things I say in the book is that even though faith is an interpretation of things, it's not an interpretation in the sense that first we see a material reality and then we see it as creation, as something that is created by God. Let me exemplify by, if I don't see a particular material shape and then interpret it as a chair which I can sit on, but because I see a chair, I'm conditioned by my upbringing and so on to see that material object as a chair. So in a way it's intuitively so. Well, if Christian faith is a mode of life, it is a mode of life where I'm training myself to see God's creation as creation. Doesn't necessarily mean that I succeed every time, but it means that by adopting this particular mode of life, I'm not sort of interpreting the world from a distance as creation, which would mean that I can. The experience of God is not something that is beside the world. It's if we experience God, it is through the world. And of course, this experience of God is not just something simple. It could be the experience, and it surely often is, the experience of the absence of God as much as the presence of God. And this also definitely goes for the Incarnation, which is not just, Jesus isn't just carrying a sign saying, here it is, God. But it's to experience that story about Jesus as divine, as an intuitive appropriation of a certain mode of life, which also belongs to the understanding of the world as creation. So, which means that it's not a matter just of cognitively thinking that this is so, but it's actually a matter of experiencing. Not an experience is it's not just feelings either, or just looking on things, but it's more of a reflecting on things you see and hear and live, and bringing them in your experience that molds or shapes this particular mode of life, which gives rise to this experience. So in a sense, it's a training, and it's as much aesthetic as it is cognitive, and so on. Aesthetic in the more original sense of sense impressions.
Well, maybe you could say a bit then about liturgy. You describe the role of liturgy and its connection to this learning to see the world as God's world, and really cultivating the art of gazing.
Yeah, well, I think the key word is cultivating. The liturgy is a way of cultivating a certain mode of life, a certain way to look upon the world. And by liturgy, I don't mean necessarily any particular liturgy. So it's the Lutheran liturgy that makes you see the world as creation, and it's not necessarily either some official church's liturgy. But if human beings are relational, which means in some sense socially shaped, the habits and that we all have is, in a sense, our liturgy. There's secular liturgies as well as religious liturgies, and not necessarily competing. I mean, there's in Europe now, this is sort of the end of soccer season, because the Premier League has finished, and La Liga has finished, and Serie A in Italy is finished, and this is in a sense part of my personal liturgical year, and not necessarily very important to anybody who is practicing Christianity, but to me it makes sense, and so it's part of my liturgy, because then again in the autumn it all starts again, and liturgical in that sense that there are habits that repeats themselves and significantly shape the way I'm living. And of course, a better liturgy than just watching soccer or football is probably the social relations we have to people, and where celebrations and dinners and parties and so on are part of the liturgical celebrations, as are, I would suggest, also more traditional church services or going to mass and so on. So all these things shape how we perceive the world, and therefore it's we need to pay some attention to what kind of liturgies we want to be part of. Is that explaining something, or is it?
Yeah, no. I found the end of part 2 to be a section where unless you understand that there are social, political, economic, national identity, and all these type of liturgies, then the bigger ethical and political questions you bring up later in the book, and their connection to the Incarnation, may seem foreign. But once you realize that part of faith, at least this is how I understood what you were arguing, that like one point you talk about the doxological person as one who comes to understand their existence in this fundamental relationality that is in as a Christian, turns towards communion in the Eucharist. And you have this line in there where he said, to celebrate communion is to stand in a line of endless improvised variations on one and the same theme, which is not given prior to the improvisations, but rather in, with, and under them. And, and that plays off of, a very Lutheran line, but it also demonstrates that what you're describing and this connection to your own embodiment and your place in the church and your place in the body of Christ is an enacted it's an enacted identity, and that enactment has ethical and political consequences. And I wonder how you begin conversations with Christians who, when they want to think about ethics and politics, they're like, well, here's a good line. Jesus said we should obey it or not, depending on probably how it affects you. Or, well, the Bible says this about this political question or this ethical one. That what you are describing is something that, finding a Bible verse and a conclusion isn't going to be the solution. And I think the church too often has that tendency, and I think you're giving you're giving more responsibility to the Christian in the church to think out these ethical and political questions.
Yeah, definitely so. I don't think there are any proof texts where you can read off the solutions to particular political problems in our time. I think the Bible, so to speak, is a script that is meant to be enacted, and the enactment is through the churches. And so it's a social enactment which empowers the individual also to enact by yourself what it would mean. But it's this enactment must always be an improvisation, because you're living. There's a certain contingency about where you live, and it's not, and there are people coming from elsewhere that challenges your improvisations, which means that you have to still improvise. So that's how I perceive the sort of ethical and political foundation for a Christian life, rather than saying we're against this or we are for this. It's not so simple.
Mm-hmm. So when you go to all the different ways like this, the whole third part of the book are these different excursions and descriptions of the body, and when you were going to work on like the philosophical body or the erotic body or the liturgical body, or what are you hoping to do with each kind of avenue of inquiry?
Well, I'm thinking that I don't. Well, Nietzsche somewhere says that anything that could be defined is dead because it's static. And whatever the body is, it's not static; it's dynamic, right? And so to understand what embodiment means, I need to approach it in many different ways. So the first chapter of the third part is on the philosophical body, and that's where I'm trying to explain what I mean by embodiment through historical discourses, but also through primarily Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Michel Foucault. And so I'm in dialogue with some of the more prominent philosophers who have thought about embodiment in the 20th century. And after that, it's a chapter, as we've spoken about, the liturgical body, and then also about the grotesque body and the erotic body. And all these are sort of different angles on what it means to be embodied, not just in a philosophical sense, but in practices. And so the grotesque body is to try to grapple with that we actually do have embodied experiences that are not so pleasant, so to speak. There's in illness and disease and in pain, there is an experience of, if you so will, a gap in the body where I don't feel that I am a body, but rather that I have a body, because the body is a burden to me. If I feel pain, I suffer, and this suffering is a way of relating to the pain in my body. So the embodiment is not just about, feeling good, and that experience needs to be dealt with from a theology of the body. But also, of course, there's the erotic body, where I'm trying to speak about erotic desire and positively in the Christian tradition, and try to put that kind of desire in where it rightly belongs. So actually, I'm trying to show that the Christianity shouldn't be as ascetical or prudential, or what's the word? It must actually incorporate the sense of the goodness of creation, even in desiring of that creation, which might mean another person. And so this is a very short outline of what these chapters try to do.
When you are going through part 3, like, what are the conclusions or arguments you make that you think are most shocking to the people next to you in the pew? Like, what are the insights that you think the church is pretty neglectful of, that you're wanting to emphasize to really reshape the conversation the church is having about what its own identity is?
But that's of course, that is dependent upon context. But one of the areas is the area of sexuality. Of course, I think not all of. I'm not the only one who's saying this. I'm definitely not alone in that sense. But I think the churches need to find a way to a more positive view of sexuality and, as I said, erotic desire, and that's sort of has been a problem almost in the entire Christian tradition, but in different ways. If in the earliest Christianity actually did say something positive about the erotic, but sublimated it, saying that the real erotic desire is actually for God, not for other human beings, and don't want to see that as a competition. I think that's wrong. And the more modern Christianity sees erotic desire in more naturalistic sense, almost in that erotic desire is just for procreation. And I think that's wrong too. And I think this needs to be dealt with more carefully than I've done in this book. So that might be shocking. This also implies, and I think this is directed more towards perhaps a Protestant Christianity that it has been negligent of the senses, and so one thing I discovered was that there is or has always been a good Catholic film critic tradition, but there's no obvious Protestant candidate in film critics. So questions on aesthetics, for instance, and from film and art and so on has often, not always, been dominated by Catholics. And well, there's nothing wrong with that, of course, but I think Protestantism, especially modern Protestantism, needs to turn back to the senses and the importance of senses, not only listening, but also seeing and touching and so on. And
if you think of, at least in the United States, what Protestants do when they discuss films, are essentially list off all the prohibitions that are violated in the film, so that someone that is innocent and young doesn't see the wrong thing, and they take a very antagonistic relationship to film as a medium or as an art, and really see it as a place. Ideologies just get reinforced, and they're either with us or against us.
Mm-hmm. That's not how I see film, but I understand what you mean.
So I'm interested in what if you were thinking of teaching a class where you're going to talk about embodiment and half the text are films. What are the films that you would want to to view and use for conversation with your students?
Well, let me begin somewhere else. When I teach embodiment in the class, I usually show them advertisement photographs of young women with very little clothes on them, and try to explain what's going on in these images and how they objectify the body, and how this becomes it's in some sense the perfect body, because it's always manipulated in before it's published. So it's not what you would have seen if you would have been where the photo was taken. And so I start with the advertisement industry and the way it affects our perception of what it means to have a perfect body. So that's where I usually start. If I would have started with film, I might begin with, well, maybe Lars von Trier, the Danish author, Breaking the Waves. Mm-hmm. And so on, because I think he sometimes deal with the question of embodiment in an interesting way, especially, maybe in Breaking the Waves and some other movies. I also probably would include someone like Pedro Almodovar, the Spanish director. There's a wonderful movie. It's about, if I remember correctly, transvestites, called All About My Mother, which also would be interesting. So on the top of my head, these were, I would probably start there. There would be others as well.
So if you had to pick one of the Jesus films, one of the ones about Jesus, would it be Jesus of Montreal? So you get the advertisement scene where the turning of the tables, where they're trying to film the commercial, and then the Jesus's own body gets you have the whole eyes being put in someone.
I always start with the what's it called in English? The Passion of
St. Matthew,
St. Matthew by Pasolini. I think that's for me, that's the number one, and there's no number two or number three, but then maybe number four is Jesus from Montreal.
So tell us, because I know for you this was a while ago that you wrote this book. So when you finished it, what were the new questions that came up that drove your kind of future theological and philosophical work as you came to teach systematic theology full time?
I've been doing several things since I finished this book. I've been dealing with questions of theology and the arts, especially visual arts. I'm still somewhat involved in some projects on that, and I also so that's the aesthetic side of this book. And And secondly, I've been doing things that has to do with politics and also political theology and secularization. So I wrote a book in Swedish, which the English title would have been The Post-Secular Condition, where I try to understand what more going out from this idea of the social embodiment, that ethics and politics is about social embodiment. What kind of ideas did or should Christianity embody? I try to discuss this quite close to modern ideas like freedom and tolerance and human rights. And thirdly, I've also been involved with health questions. I've been directing a Center for Culture and Health for 6 years here at the university. It's a center, not a theological center, but a center where we try to integrate insights from all kinds of faculties into what this would mean for health. And fourthly, if I may add, because this is the last one, I've also embarked on what I thought would be a very small project, but it turned out it wasn't. So I'm writing about subjectivity, because what would subjectivity mean in relation to this understanding of the body that I have in this book? And this project, I mentioned it briefly, is about humor, subjectivity, and transcendence. I find that the idea of humor is interesting to understand what it means to be a human being, and especially what subjectivity means. This is sort of the major project that I'm dealing with. So I'm a bit everywhere.
So when you were working on questions around post-secularity, how would you describe or what kind of insights do you gain from being in a country with a very different trajectory than even other parts of Europe and the United States and Canada?
I think what I'm trying to suggest is that I use the concept of post-secularity, trying to suggest that there are different trajectories going on all the time. Some secularize and some, desecularize. So it's not as simple as that there would be a story with a particular goal where the more modern Sweden would become, the less religious it would be. And so I'm trying to suggest in this book that we actually do come from a history where even our understanding of what secularity means has Christian roots. So secularity is not a non-Christian phenomenon. And when it comes to religion, what has happened in Sweden is obviously that the Church of Sweden doesn't play that big a role for the majority of the population anymore. Doesn't mean that religion is not interesting. Maybe it's more interesting than it has been for a long time at the moment, but in a different way than a majority state church would have been. So the situation is interesting. I cannot foresee where it's going, but it's so post-secularity is for me a concept where I try to describe how ambivalent and ambiguous this situation actually is, and so it's not a massive return to religion, but it's not a massive secularization either, but it's much more nuanced and complex.
So in the United States, one of the problems I think that shapes theological conversation is that once God becomes something that's plausible or not, then and yet large portions of the church feel the need to protect itself or put up bulwarks, basically to deny or just lambaste anyone that rejects the reality of God. The question of God becomes more a political question than a theological one, and I wonder if if that's different in your context, like is what the conversation between people that would identify as theist or atheist or something in between, what that looks like, and if there's fruitful ways of having that conversation that don't set a question where, like the question of God, where like I can imagine having a life with meaning and purpose with different answers to the question, and yet the question does shape the liturgical life of the church, and it's intimately connected to kind of the concept of incarnation and embodiment that you describe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think, I mean, we also have culture wars in some sense here, but not at all like the ones you have in the US. I have some experience of those in the US, but so we actually do have interesting conversations. I belong to a department of literature, history of ideas, and religion. So theology is one of several specialities, and just this is just an example of this, and it's definitely not it's not a Christian university that I belong to. It's not a non-Christian either. It's not a secularistic university, but we have extremely interesting conversations among the fellows on the department and on theological question, whether they believers or not, or in between, or I don't know. I mean, I don't usually ask my colleagues what they believe and so on. So there's definitely a good conversation going on here. This is a privileged space, a university. I realize that. The challenge for a country like Sweden is to accept plurality for real. Many Swedes, including maybe all the leading parties, well, not only the leading parties, but all the parties, have difficulties with grappling what plurality actually might mean, where everybody belongs to a minority. And from my very limited experience of the US, I was in Princeton for 10 months. It's quite different in the US. And what I really did like about the US situation was the consciousness that everybody actually belongs to a minority. Because we do really have a problem of a kind of superficial hegemony in Sweden, where it's taken for granted that there is a particular way of looking upon things that is the way of looking upon things. That's sort of disappearing, I think, but we do still need to grapple with plurality here. So everything is not only roses and good conversations, of course, but there's this question of actually being able to differ as well as not being able to have something in common.
So how does the recognition of that plurality and the kind of robust affirmation of embodiment that you describe shape your own piety or the way you practice your faith, participate in the life of the church and such?
That's a good question. For one thing, it's important for me to belong to a tradition and to participate in the liturgy in the literal sense, to go to church on Sunday or any other day, and so that's sort of this ritual and also this symbolic aspects of Christianity is very important to me, because I think it shapes my whole way of thinking. So I couldn't do what I do without them. But I also I'm trying to improvise what it would mean to live a Christian life at precisely that moment where I find myself. And well, maybe that sounds a bit funny. I mean, given that I'm a Christian theologian and this is what I'm working with, but But as any occupation, academic life has so many more things to it than just, teaching, reading, writing, and drinking coffee. It's a lot of relations that are going on, and I'm not saying that I'm very successful, but I'm trying to think what would it mean to live this life here, and in some sense, in all humbleness, being a witness in this moment here, and trying to do good. This is not a very, this is probably a very traditional answer, but I what I'm reaffirming is both the idea of actually doing what I'm doing where I am, and finding myself sort of this is where I should be, and what would it mean to be someone who's very interested in soccer and who lives in the Christian mode of life. That's a challenge, but also to publicly and explicitly belong to a tradition that actually means something, and not just toying with the idea of Christianity, and being explicit about it is also important for me. So I don't. It's not just an academic interest. I think we need to see much more engagement in academia. Not everybody would be engaged in Christian theology, but some would be engaged in politics or something else. But I think engagement is hugely important to actually have something important to say, whatever you're teaching.
When you were describing that, and in a couple places in the book where you talk about the role of liturgy and such, I feel like it gives a different type of advice than maybe is popular among more mainline Protestants in the United States. I feel like here there's a tendency to, like, when you have doubts or questions about your faith, or you're thinking through your faith and becoming an adult, there's a sense that you permit a level of disengagement from the life of the church and the body of the church, and that the terms for your own life of faith or spiritual journey, or whatever language they want to use, is one where you as the individual are deciding, what I believe and what I don't believe that my tradition says, if I participate and how I participate, all the way down to, as a parent, you're like, well, maybe I'll just let them decide when they get older what they want to do, as long as they're moral in the process. And the assumptions about how subjectivity is shaped, relationships shape it, and the whole notion of cultivating the gaze, I think, says, like, yeah, you're cutting way more off than you imagine by disengaging that much.
Well, I think it's. I try to I try to practice what I speak about in this book, at least in the sense that I'm trying to understand myself as a relational being, and which would mean that I do disengage from certain things, but it's not necessarily because I don't care about them, and I think it's not. I think this sense of being a relational being, but also being a part of a tradition, means that not everything depends on me and my choice. So it takes some pressure off. It's not about me having to rise up every morning to see whether I believe in the virgin birth, so to speak. And it's the virgin birth is there, at least as a symbol, whatever I believe about it. And as a symbol, it gives rise to thought. But it's not a pressure that I must tick off all the boxes every hour of the day to what I believe and so on. So doubt obviously have its place within this trajectory, and I'm against a kind of Protestantism that puts so much pressure on the individual and forces them to quite radical choices, because I think this isn't necessarily the best way on how to become part of a tradition and to become and to keep your honesty and your seriousness within that tradition, that there might be part of it that you're not very comfortable with.
Well, in one of the things that you emphasized in the liturgical body chapter is how what Christians mean by God is something that's communicated not simply in words, but in bodies, in images, in actions, in community, and that a lot of a person not engaged in enacting in the community will be at a deficit when trying to understand what the words themselves look, sound, and mean. If you're not connected to the community where they have purchase.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are such things as practic knowledge or tacit knowledge, and for one thing, and then there also the sense that our mode of life. I consciously don't choose the word worldview because I don't think it captures what Christianity is about as good as a mode of life. And so a mode of life is a way of relating. And obviously our relations are not only cognitive, but affective and affective, that our feelings are within them, as well as our memories and our hopes and so on. And to get a sense of God, it's not just a matter of my own thoughts about God, but it's also a matter of what I hope for. In his catechesis, Martin Luther said that the God is what you hope for, that your ultimate good is going to come for. So everybody has a God, but it could be a different God, because they hope more from themselves or from money or from whatever than God. So it's also, and that's of course a struggle in any person's life to deal with one's own idols, and those are often more practical than theoretical, so to speak. I might confess my faith in God every Sunday, but in practice I might worship Mammon as much as the biblical God.
Mm-hmm. So, what do you think Christian theologians have to learn most from theologians that are engaging, like Zizek or someone like that? What are the primary insights or questions raised by non-confessional or church-centered theology?
Oh, well, well, Zizek is tricky because of some things that I think you definitely shouldn't learn from him. But nevertheless, I think what Zizek, among others, helped me to understand is that the question of hope is something quite different than optimism. And Zizek doesn't have a very optimistic view of the world or of himself. And I think he learns us to understand what sin might be about, a lesson that has been largely forgotten in many Christian traditions, modern traditions, where sin has become something moralistic. And he also shows, I think, the need for a radical transformation to actually understand what it is that we are hoping for, which means that Christianity is something much more radical than it has been put forward as. So Zizek is very interesting to engage with, in that sense that he's so radical and puts everything, on on the eye of a needle and in as extreme way as possible. So that's and I think the entire psychoanalytic tradition is actually helpful in trying to grapple with things that has to do with darkness and sin and negativity and suffering and so on. So lots of things to learn, but I think one needs to re-Christianize those insights and to put them more fully in a Christian tradition, because Zizek to me sometimes sounds as if it's Christianity, but without the hope. It's the cross, but there's no hallelujahs coming after the cross, so to speak. So it's a very bleak hope. I think what is delivering us.
Mm-hmm. So when I know a lot of people that, at least among young theologians in the United States, there's a resurgence in radical theology and theologians that could have been inspired by Zizek or Nietzsche and this type of thing who see a kind of the death of God, or the death of at least the God they want dead. When you resist certain kind of critiques or radical maneuvers, like, and you say there that, Zizek gets to a place that needs to be re-Christianized and that type of thing. What are the intuitions or touchstones for you as a Christian theologian that leads you to want to resist or reinterpret or go further?
Oh, I'm afraid that Zizek might end up being very nihilistic. I mean, he's speaking about revolution, but what does it mean by revolution? Is the revolution going to come? And if it's going to come, what is it? Is it just a catastrophe where something new begins? And I'm afraid that might end up in some kind of nihilism, and that's why I'm not always. I mean, I read some of the radical theologians and whatever that means, because it's not entirely clear to me what kind of theology that is and compared to what. But I think the question of hope is what are there any grounds for hope? Political hope, ethical hope, and also, of course, hope for our existence, both collectively and personal. And I think some of the radical theology that I've been reading is just too Protestant in a very nihilistic sense, that it's end up with the ultimate sacrifice, that we sacrifice everything, and that's not very hopeful to me. That's a very simplistic answer, I know that, and so I think it's a matter of, I think they do a very good job in showing the negativity that's important to understand what subjectivity is about. But I'm not so sure if there's another moment after negativity, if we get something back. It's Kierkegaard's, Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher and theologian. It's his question. What about, do we get something back? Is there a repetition after death? Is there still life? And I hope there is, and that's what I find lacking in some of those radical theologians. These are extremely interesting, so I'm not dissing them, but I don't find the idea of hope there. And when I do read psychoanalytic writers, I more often find hope in those kinds of writers than in some of those radical theologians.
So how would you contrast then, like, Zizek's work in radical politics and in theology with, someone like Terry Eagleton or you have this radical politics, but also someone that, locates themselves in the life of the church?
Well, this is what my book on Zizek was about. It's about theology and Marxism and Eagleton and Zizek.
Really?
Yeah. Did you know that?
No.
Okay, right. No. Well, it's if I can use 10 seconds to advertise it, it's out on Paul Graham Macmillan since 2012, and it's called A Conspiracy of Hope. I think that in this book I call Zizek a Protestant atheist and Eagleton a Catholic agnostic, but I got a very nice letter from Terry Eagleton where he said that he didn't himself believe that he was an agnostic, but more of a Christian. But I think there's a different eschatology. Whereas Zizek has his eschatology is so radical, so it's very hard to understand here and now what might come after the revolution, which means, so to speak, that he interprets the entire creation as we now have it as bound for destruction. Whereas Eagleton is actually his eschatology is not as radical as Zizek's, and so even though there are huge problems with our world here today, with, environmental destruction, poverty, inequality between the sexes, and so on, there's still something good in creation that we can recognize that will hopefully give us some hint of what is meant to come after the revolution. So this means that Eagleton isn't as drastic as Zizek, and he has got this idea of negativity, but there's also affirmation. And I think even though there are problems with Eagleton too, I think, from a theological perspective, but nevertheless, he has this sense of affirmation that comes after negation. That's important to me, and I think is helpful not only for theology but for making a good judgment about society today. That not everything might be bound for destruction. That there are pockets of good things that might be something to build upon. So it's not as he's not as super Protestant as Zizek is.
So we're nearing up on the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, and I'm interested in what you think the question is that should be preoccupying the church if we're thinking of where to go in the next 500 years. Like what question should be lingering on the minds of the church today?
How, from an intra-church perspective, how do we get how do we build strong liturgical churches that aren't hierarchical and don't cater to that kind of authoritarianism that might occasionally plague some of the liturgical churches, and from a more, maybe even more important, how do we live a Christian life together in a generous mode that isn't a contrast to either religions or non-religion. So to give up the neurotic occupation about where the borders of the church ends and the other begins, so to speak. So I want a more still within the liturgical tradition, a more fluid church which isn't as preoccupied by its own borders, but more of finding its way of a Christian mode of life in a pluralistic situation where the churches actually accept that plurality is here to stay.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think those are important questions. And now I've been asking you lots of questions. So is there something you want to say, share, or thoughts you want to make sure you got to communicate before we wrap things up?
I think a lot of obviously I hope that some people will read my book, but I also think that it needs improvement, especially I think what could this mean in practice? It's a quite theoretical book. It's actually a very theoretical book, and I'm not ashamed of writing theoretical books because that's what I'm good at. But I think it needs to be spelled out what this might mean in practice. And again, it's a matter of improvisation, not about that I've written a map or a blue chart of where we're going, but I think it's a matter of improvisation. But so it really needs to be thought through. I think what these ideas on a vision or gaze and embodiment and including sexuality, what they actually might mean for living a full Christian life.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to hop on the internet and connect. And I've really enjoyed the conversation and enjoyed the book.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have been possible to be on this pod talk.